looking at the critical and contemporary issues facing the Muslim world from different perspectives, generating new ideas, bringing to you all this and a lot more in Voices from the Muslim World.
That faith is 70 sub-branches. أعلاها قول لا إله إلا الله. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in that ayah is a failing in a political obligation. Having a single ummah and a single political entity was, to the Sahaba, so important that they went to war for it. He makes the claim that the imamah is an obligation both by reason and revelation. Modernity can do nothing right in the modern world, that is human beings. Anything that's new has to be evil by default. Wallahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. That is called heteronomy. Only 3% of Muslim trade is intra-Muslim trade. So I don't use the word Islamic State, you will notice, because that's a technical issue.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome from İLKE Foundation, Istanbul. We are back with another guest for a series of Voices from the Muslim World. We are honored to be joined by an esteemed figure from University of Toledo, a young scholar, very influential among the Muslims in the United States and other parts of the world, Dr. Ovamir Anjum. Dr. Ovamir Anjum is a prolific writer and an articulate speaker, and his expertise are ranging from topics like liberalism and its interaction with Islam to the reinvigoration of Khilafah and Caliphate. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, and thank you for your precious time, Dr. Ovamir.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
With your permission, we can switch to questions right away.
Sure.
So, if I may refer to some of the scholars which we have hosted under the same program and what we have understood from their thoughts regarding the plight of the Muslim Ummah, is that it roots from certain factors, and the most important of them, what we understood, are that the lack of proper institutions in the Muslim world, and then the loss of political power from the Muslim bloc, and thirdly, the intellectual strife which is going on in the Muslim Ummah. So if I may put the same question to you, do you think these are the primary reason, or which, according to you, is the most important reason for this plight?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Thank you very much for having me and for this really whopper of a question. To think about the greatest problem, the biggest problem, is in fact a religious question, because there is no empirical way by which a human being can know the greatest problem that he or she has, right? This is a matter of aqidah. Small problems that you can tinker with, day-to-day problems, those are problems that one knows rationally, one knows empirically. But the greatest problem of life, which then affects everything else, the greatest failures, the greatest successes, those are non-falsifiable questions. So, or propositions. And so I always begin answer to this question to myself with the saying of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that al-iman bid'un sab'un wa bid'un wa sab'una shu'bah. That faith is 70 sub-branches. أعلاها قول لا إله إلا الله. The highest of it is the kalima la ilaha illallah, wa adnaha imatatul adha anit tariq. And the lowest one is to remove harm from people's way. These are all branches of faith. And so the problem is always faith. And the job of good intellectual inquiry is to know which branches need what kind of care. Now, to the question of, Muslim, which branches I think need care, I think that always the crucial branch that needs care is the collective Iman, collective faith, but the weakness then appears in various forms. Sometimes the weakness is political, and it requires action that is collective. And political, sometimes weakness has to do with individuals, their inability to reform what is within themselves. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah does not change the affair of a people, the state of a people, unless they change what is within themselves, between themselves. And so I think that from this perspective, political legitimacy in the Muslim world is one of the greatest problems. But only as a branch of the real problem that is the greatest problem, which is Iman. And it cannot be solved by merely acute, alert, systematic political analysis. It requires going back to the covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Muslims made. It requires reviving that our part of the deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
True.
كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. So that is the foundation of our political malaise.
Let's touch upon all of them one by one. So since you started with the political, the loss of the political power, and I know that, you very articulately explain in many of your lectures about the reinvigoration of caliphate. So if I may start with asking that, do you think that the political reinvigoration of Islam or the Islamic state is required? And secondly, if it is, does Islam outlay a specific political system?
Let's begin with first things first. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 84, 85, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala censures the Israelites for an important failing. Surah Al-Baqarah is a charge sheet, meaning it lists in the first half of the surah all the things that the Israelites, all respects in which they failed in order to then deserve Allah's wrath. And now they were being, in the form of Islam, being given another chance to believe and follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in that ayah is a failing in a political obligation. And it's the strongest charge, if you will, that is made against them. أفتؤمنون ببعض الكتاب وتكفرون ببعض فما جزاء من يفعل ذلك إلا خزي في الحياة الدنيا ويوم القيامة يردون إلى أشد العذاب. Do you believe in part of the book and reject part of the book? And what's the recompense for someone who does that, except that they are humiliated in this world, and bil'iyad billah, they go back to a worse punishment in afterlife. Allah protect us and our ummah from that.
Ameen.
This charge is given in Al-Baqarah because it is a mirror to the future of the new ummah that was now being given this tafdeel, this superior place, not because we are special genetically, biologically, but because we have the book and the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the deal that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes, the covenant Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes with His chosen people is different. The Israelites could never thrive in history when they turn away from the message of Allah when others could. Why? Not because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hated them, but because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loved them. And what was, in this particular case, what was their failing? The failing was not that they were not spiritual enough, not that they were, not, failing in some particular aspect. They, in fact, seem to live by the Torah, and were the only ones who resisted paganism. In fact, in Arabia, nearly all other communities had made concessions to, having, for instance, their idols, their God worshipped as idols in the Kaaba. The Jews didn't. But Allah has commanded them in the covenant to not kill yourself and not drive yourself out of your houses. Meaning, in the very primitive pre-state world, this was the essence of political solidarity. And it is in this test that they failed, even though out of piety, when they would betray other tribes, other believers, after the betrayal, they would sell them, when Israelites or Jews are lost and sold in slavery, when they would purchase them and free them. That was a commandment they had. But they are the ones who had been responsible for their loss and their killing and their being driven out of their houses. So they were following the part of the commandment in the book that was easy, that was spiritual, that was personal, that was something that you could do easily. But they were abandoning the larger commandment of political solidarity. In our Islamic terms, this would be they were failing in ummatic solidarity and in the political responsibility. So Muslim, preachers today speak of the priority of being spiritual, getting legal minutiae right, that they were doing all of that.
So if we continue from what you have said, one thing is conceptual understanding of the responsibility of the reinvigoration of the political power. So, okay, we agreed upon that. Now, there is something, obviously, if we have to change the status quo, there needs to be something pragmatic. So, in the presence of the nation states which exist today, if we are talking about some caliphate or if we are talking about some Islamic political system, what are the stepstones for that?
Let me suggest that there are other questions prior to that we should address. First, there are, of course, all kinds of reasons that one may not make it one's personal priority to think about politics, to work for reinvigorating politics. So I'm not going to address the personal projects and missions that scholars and preachers have. But the idea that this is not a priority, that this is not a collective obligation, fard kifai, let me first sort of set that in context. For throughout Islamic history, from the very beginning until the end of the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, this was one obligation that all ulama of all schools, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, Shia, Sunni, even Ibadis, the remaining sect of the Khawarij, all Muslims agreed on one thing. There is not a single text that represents an authoritative opinion in any century that I have been able to trace, with a couple of exceptions I'll talk about, that says that this obligation, that the reestablishment of the caliphate, of course that's a modern phrase of it, but what they mean is that the way they phrase it is an imamate, having an imam is not an obligation, right? There's no one who says that. The exceptions being some Khawarij in the first century, whether they were Khawarij or Mu'tazila, there's some debate about that. But even their opinion was not that we can have a secular government. What they meant to say, there is no need for any government at all. They were nomadic sort of people in case of Khawarij, and in case of Mu'tazila, they simply believed that they were like extreme libertarians or something, or anarchists. And their opinion, by the way, some of these same Khawarij in this era also believed that there are only 3 prayers, not 5. So if you're going to take outliers and question ijma', consensus of the ummah and of the sahaba, of the companions, on the basis of a new opinion or some outliers, then nothing remains in deen, right? And so what I find remarkable is with the ease with which some modern ulama or preachers are able to set aside what is a matter of ijma' among the ulama and what is claimed by all the ulama to be ijma' of the Sahaba. So Sunni Islam, if you will, is based on this foundation, that this is the ijma' consensus of the Sahaba, and this is what explains the actions of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh and Umar, and then when there is a later between Ali and Muawiyah radiallahu anh, they rather go to war than split the difference and say, you keep Sham, I keep Iraq, and let's be happy about it. Having a single ummah and a single political entity was, to the Sahaba, so important that they went to war for it. In the case of, latter case, in the case of Abu Bakr and Umar and Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah and others, they rushed, of course, to the portico of Banu Sa'ida before even the Prophet ﷺ was buried. And so the ulama have always understood this to be not only ijma', but the paradigmatic case of ijma' of the Sahaba. So if you read in any book of what is ijma' of Sahaba, what's the cases of ijma' in Sahaba, this would be the most paradigmatic case. In fact, Imam al-Juwayni, the great Ash'ari theologian who was teacher of al-Ghazali, rahimahumullah, in his book, Ghiyath al-Umam fil Tiyath al-Dhulam, the most important and authoritative text on the subject, although it's less influential or less popular than Ahkam al-Sultaniyah or al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyah of al-Mawardi, nevertheless it's more detailed and more, for the ulama specialist, it's more authoritative. It bases the case of the Khilafah and of the obligation of an imamah not on ahadith. Why? Because as an Ash'ari, he held that ahad hadith are not sufficient for ilm, for qat'i, for definitive knowledge. And because this is an arch obligation in a matter of aqidah, it needed to be established with something stronger than ahad hadith. That is why the book is, much of the book is, if you will, constructed around ijma' and showing the ijma' of the Sahaba on this matter as a paradigmatic ijma', and then going from there and saying, well, what happens if we don't have a Khalifa, if we don't have an Imam? And then you know, what happens if any political leadership, you know, then ulama take over. If the ulama are missing, then what happens? So it's really an amazing treatise. But the point is that this is a paradigmatic position. I have not seen any scholar of repute who is followed among any Muslims decry it, disagree with it, provide an alternative opinion on this question. On most other questions of detail, there is disagreement. That's the purpose of this book, by the way, to separate matters that are definitive from matters that are not definitive. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, because you know, he is an Athari, he does accept hadith as leading to definitive knowledge. He makes the claim that the imamah is an obligation both by reason and revelation. And then he goes to show the revelation proof in his book Minhaj as-Sunnah, hadith, and also rational proofs. So, and then you can see that in every century, you know, every era, that the ulama who are followed. Now, of course, there are sometimes ulama who are sort of secretary of some, you know, state secretaries, people who are literateurs and not proper ulama, who will sometimes make more imaginative comments, not questioning this, but rather talking about, well, the Khalifa now is, you know, this or that position, which I'm not going to go into. But my question is that if you take this bedrock of Sunni Islam and you dismiss it like a fly sitting, you know, on your nose, and then you come to us and talk about hijab, you talk about spirituality, like find me a word for spirituality in Arabic, actually. But that becomes your focus. But what appears in the Quran and in the Sunnah and is ijma' of the Sahaba, is a bedrock of Ahl Sunnah, if that becomes is just dismissed, right? Then why would you not allow anybody else to do with Islam whatever they wanted? So there may be somebody who says, you know, the ayat of hijab were contextual, they're not clear anyway. Wearing bikini is just as good if so long as you do that modestly, you know, just on the beaches or something. Somebody else will say, well, perhaps prayers, the number of prayers can be questioned because, you know, we're rejecting the Sunnah. And so the health of a tradition that you were talking about, people who say that we follow the tradition. The health of a tradition depends on this methodological commitment to the roots of the tradition, to the trunk of the tradition before the branches. But if you, you know, if you are picking and choosing from a tradition based on a logic that is extraneous to the tradition, based on your personal convenience, or perhaps some new book that you read, or perhaps your own personal political, social circumstance, and all of us Muslims today and in the era of nation state find ourselves having to make compromises. But if you don't negotiate with the tradition on its own terms, then there is no such thing as tradition. There's just your view versus my view. And so I don't think that people, now why am I saying this? In the 20th century, as you know, famously in 1926, an Egyptian politician and scholar who was trained also at Oxford, Ali Abdul Razak, wrote this book rejecting the same, you know, the obligation of the imamah, or that Islam has any political obligation. Thankfully, he was a scholar and he knew what he was talking about. and he did not mince his words. He knew that in order to attack the political nature of Islam, he had to attack Abu Bakr himself, the Sahaba himself, because it was very clear from the Sahaba that this agreement was clear. Now, as a result of Abdul Raziq, Ali Abdul Raziq's treatise, as is well known, dozens of authoritative treatises by Muslim ulama from all corners of the Muslim world were written. It almost forced the articulation of a new 20th century ijma' in his refutation. Almost everyone agreed that in opposition to him.
Are there any popular refutations, like, from the figures which are popular today? Like, obviously not living ones, but the ones which were the popular refutations back then.
All the ulama, and that's the interesting thing, if you look at the literature, all the ulama, the who's who of the ulama in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, wrote a book or some kind of refutation. This stopped around the 70s when, of course, you could say the horse was dead, or at least it seemed like it was dead. But basically, Ibn Ashur, Muhammad Baqir al-Muti'i, the Azharis, Baqir Hussein, and then later, Diyauddin al-Rayis, Abdul Wahab Khalaf, all of these great scholars from all different schools, traditionalists, reformists, Egyptians, Tunisians, Syrians, and South Asians were sort of, were also involved in that, but they were sort of a little bit advanced on this question already. So, yeah, this was remarkably, this forced the articulation of the consensus. In fact, if you look at Muslim political thought, in the immediate decades after this, for 3 or 4 decades, proving the political obligation of Islam, political nature of Islam, was the dominant theme of literature, whether it's being written by anybody, but especially the ulama. The only other current that in the field, if you will, was Sayyid Qutb's current, who was concerned with the attack of secularity and trying to push that back with a strong claim about what Muslim societies had become. So that provided a second discursive strand in Muslim discourse. But the dominant strand until the 70s was this. And then after that, after the 70s, authors usually just took for granted that this was the ijma'.
Since you have referred to the strand from Sayyid Qutb, so is it not the same thing once you're refuting secularity, since what is generally understood is that secularism, it calls for the divorce between religiosity or religion and the state. So if you're refuting it to, if you rightly understand it that way, and if someone is refuting it, is it not the same as, reinvigorating the Islamic State?
So I don't use the word Islamic State, you will notice, because that's a technical issue. But going back to your question, yes, it is more, you could say that it is concerned with a higher order question, a question that is beyond, in other words, it takes this for granted, but then it says, it looks at the current world and the state of Muslim subjugation to Western imperialism, and most importantly, Western cultural imperialism. And so its question becomes different, but it takes for granted that answer.
But there are certain intellectual concepts about which we have got different connotations of them, and these connotations are leading to a strife within the Muslim groups. And among them are modernism, liberalism, and these all things are which you frequently talk about. I would love to learn from you about them, and first of all ask if you think that the modernism which we refer to today, it's at crossroads with Islam.
So you're asking if modernity or modernism contradicts Islam. Modernity is not really a well-defined ideology. It is a number of different things, and I don't think that one should demonize any age, any era, right? The Prophet ﷺ said that if someone says هَلَكَ النَّاسِ فَهُوَ أَهْلَكُهُم فَهُوَ أَهْلَكَهُم وَأَهْلَكُهُم, that if someone says that people are ruined, you know, because everything is so bad and everybody is lost it, then he is the most ruined of them, or he is the one ruining them. And so, you know, in the interest of nuance, I would say that there are many things in the modern period that are good. Some have come from outside the Muslim world and have hit us in the, you know, in the face, and some are a result of Muslims' own efforts. Muslims have not been sitting back, thankfully, unlike the preachers of secularism. In fact, Muslims have been fighting back 19th century, 20th century, and that has ensured that the world had to come back to religion. This is true of other religions as well, even though the terms on which other religions sort of come back are often those of secular nation state and neoliberal capitalism.
Yep.
Nevertheless, religion remains the center of world self-understanding. Christianity has seen a rebound, other religions. And the first religion and the most profoundly grounded religion was Islam. And this was not because Islam was sitting in the books, but because people stood up and fought back and, you know, contributed with their blood and sweat. So modernity is not a sort of a single facet. Now, there is a specific claim of modernity, particularly a progressivist understanding of history, in particular a moral kind of progressivism, which holds something like this, that human beings have made such progress, or perhaps can make such progress, that the limitations of human morality and human society and human social structure and human nature, all of these limitations that are slightly different but related, of nature, revelation of the past, you know, great religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, so on, that all of the limitations which require people to look back for guidance for some point in history, right, 1400 years back, 2000 years back, longer, all of these limitations and all of these constraints on human nature or human morality can be overcome with either reason or technology or perhaps some evolutionary struggle. This particular doctrine is you could say, for many, the underlying assumption that drives what we may call modernism or a modernist interpretation of Islam. But if your purpose is to say, look, modernity has done something, many good things, but then you have divine revelation, that is, the Quran declares itself to be perfect, and therefore you must look at that and then embrace modernity, then that's not, I don't see that that there can be a judgment against it. Then it's, if you will, an internal Muslim affair. Muslims always have had diversity. Some people are going to say, well, no, traditional, medieval centuries were better. Some people say, no, early classical period was better, and others, and that should be what should form our model for how to sort of restore a better time and better state of the ummah.
True.
So progressivism, but particularly a certain kind of progressivism, that's I think the problem. Now, there is a current, perhaps minor current, among Muslims that demonizes modernity, and you can sometimes sympathize with them for what modernity has done to the world. Modern age has resulted in many respects, whether it's environmental apocalypse or economic inequality, or most importantly, the materialism and rise of atheism and agnosticism, but even more importantly, secularism, that your personal belief in God is no longer operative in the world. You could blame modernity for that, or aspects of modernity for that. But I think that, as I mentioned earlier, what you consider to be the greatest problem and how you explain the greatest problem is an expression of your aqidah. And to some people, the demonization of modernity becomes a matter of aqidah itself, so that modernity can do nothing right in the modern world, that is human beings. Anything that's new has to be evil by default. And sometimes the converse also applies. So all traditional societies become good by this logic.
What liberalism actually is. Because, we hosted a scholar recently, and he made a comment that Islam itself is liberal, when we talk about liberalism. But obviously, as you have just said, and I've just referred to, the same words can have different connotation, and different people can understand different things from them.
Right. The word liberal, of course, comes from liberty, freedom, and in any kind of historical or academic setting, it's a modern development, and 17th century American and French revolutions were its earliest manifestations in the in a social form. There were, of course, thinkers and ideas that become champions of liberalism. For instance, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and in the 20th century, John Rawls. They're all Johns, by the way. But liberalism is, as it has evolved as a doctrine, is not merely that you have some rights. The idea of rights itself, or the idea that you have some freedom to choose your religion, that's not liberalism, because that has always existed, and no liberal scholar, no liberal actual political project would accept your definition of liberalism, if that's what you mean by liberalism. If you say that the Quran says la ikraha fi din, and therefore it is liberalism. But you could say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and in the Sunnah and through then in the formulation of Islamic law and Sharia, there is a strong emphasis on rights of human beings, huquq al-ibad, rights of God's servants. And never at the expense. So there is also, it's balanced with huquq Allah, the rights of Allah. But rights discourse is one of the characteristic discourses of liberalism, but liberal rights have a particular genealogy and precondition. Liberal rights are inalienable, and they are not given by a sort of a religious entity, a religious system. They exist as facts, as primary facts in the world. And so you cannot ask where they come from, what are their preconditions. By virtue of humans being humans, there are these rights. And God cannot take them away, even if God wanted. So, and then what is the list of rights that's involved? That becomes the big question. The biggest question is how to prioritize various claimed rights, and whose rights come first, and so on. On all of these questions, Islamic law, Sharia, has its characteristic answers. That's what make it Islamic. That's what make it God's law. But liberalism does not, as a precondition, does not accept that its rights are defined by a revelation. They come from, or they're authorized by a revelation. But there are, theoretically speaking, three main principles, if you will, of liberalism. One is autonomy, public reason, and individual freedom, individual over community. These three things. And then fourth is the rights discourse, human rights discourse, that sort of culminates in that sort of is crescendos that liberal tradition in the post-World War era. So autonomy, literally the word autonomy means I give myself my norms. I do not accept norms that are coming from outside. I don't accept authority that is outside of me.
And,
now
and
this
that,
is...
Sorry, that includes religion.
Of course, that includes primarily religion. This is Kantian idea, who is a Protestant Christian pietist, who is trying precisely to articulate how religious norms become authoritative, if at all. Well, they become authoritative because rationally I can derive them and impose on myself. I give myself these norms. Divine revelation from outside that tells you what to do, even if you don't understand it. Wallahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. That is called heteronomy, right? That is the bad guy in liberalism. That's the opposite of liberalism, is heteronomous reason. Second, public reason, which in the question in the sphere of political life, people cannot use revelation, any transcendent authority, as the reasons for their public propositions and be validly accepted. Right? That, for instance, you want to say that homosexuality is wrong, should be illegal. You cannot say that, well, the Quran says so or the Bible says so. You can rather give secular public reasons, such as, well, it might lead to,
certain problems.
Certain problems, diseases, right? AIDS or other problems that are good for the nation, right? So, but if you can talk about the nation in various forms, the public sphere or the nation, what's good for the society, and that's why when people who know this stuff, when they talk about the nation state, they fear that the nation state is the new God. It has replaced God as the final criterion of rights, of the right even to life, right? So if you betray the nation state or are deemed dangerous by the nation state, you are killed. You are called upon by the nation state to come sacrifice your life for its protection, for the protection of the state. You can take life to protect the nation state. So all the ultimate rights that used to belong to God now are transferred to the nation state. And so in a sense, liberalism requires the nation state. It limits some of the powers in some of its forms, depending on which version of liberalism you're talking about. Earlier liberals were wary of the powers of the state. Nevertheless, they require the state. You cannot really have liberalism. So in a sense, liberalism and secularism are liberalism requires secularism, but not the other way around. So you can have a authoritarian, non-liberal secularism like in China and elsewhere in Russia, but you cannot have liberalism without secularism.
I've been insisting on the pragmatic way of the reinvigoration of the state. Related to that is one concept that has come from several scholars and academicians and professionals within the Muslim ranks, and that is the integration of certain countries or converging their economic interests in terms of an economic bloc. And the example they give is from European Union. And the reason defined is that, once you converge their economic interests within the bloc, that would naturally bring them together and do mutually beneficial things, like it has happened in the European Union. So do you agree with such practical first steps, or do you think that thinking of the material way of converging these countries or their targets, it's itself falling astray to the axioms of the system that is contrary to Islam?
These efforts by literally there are some 1.8, 1.7 billion Muslims, and literally hundreds of thousands of Muslims who are concerned and have different potentialities, different perspectives. And frankly, you are not going to, even if there is some kind of unification, the question of technical know-how and a pragmatic ability to deliver services, to keep promises, to keep prices down, for example, to keep exploitation from in sort of internal chaos, as we are seeing, for example, in Taliban or to some degree in Turkey, to find solutions to that, though that would be absolutely necessary. So I think that I believe in parallel efforts where from different perspectives, there needs to be a discursive change where Muslims embrace an ummatic thinking, where Muslims, there are some people perhaps who should emphasize social solidarity. Right. Others, how to create, design political institutions that could represent large numbers of Muslims in such a way that their local autonomy, of course, I'm using the word in a more banal sense, the local self-government is not taken away. As you know, there was in 1958 a unification of 3 Arab countries, UAR, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq, and it didn't go well, partly because the reasons weren't good, but also because it immediately became evident that the dominant power is going to exploit the others, and so and it lasted only for 3 years. So I think that practical questions are important, and economic integration is extremely important, and I think that it's also to some degree for those people who want to do this, a path of least resistance, but perhaps most work. It will require, currently, I was told this number, only 3% of Muslim trade is intra-Muslim trade. And I think that regional economic institutions and regional economic activity is going to be important if we're going to move forward with any kind of the building up of Islamic civilization that is autonomous.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ovamir. Thank you for your precious time. Hope to see you again
You're welcome.
in a similar program again. Jazakallah khair.
Looking at the critical and contemporary issues facing the Muslim world from different perspectives, generating new ideas, bringing to you all this and a lot more in Voices from the Muslim World.